Okie dokie. So here we are once again. And this is back on the theme of the taboo of grief in relationship to how we see a society, in relationship to how we express ourselves, and in relationship to how we as individuals have our own experience around grief, and how you're and sometimes it's in relationship to how you're seeing other people experience it as well. So Marcus, this is really a forum for you to share your understanding, your perception, your experience around the around the theme of the taboo of grief.
I'm excited for it. Because I know I left some hints around how I had experienced grief in my life in yours as well. So I'm looking forward to this. It has definitely been a journey to learn about grief and to see it in a much bigger way than I would have otherwise kind of overlooked in my life.
What was the I know, because you offered this as a topic, as a subject. What inspired the topic?
It was actually one of the things that I got like really early on to talk about with another magician, was to discuss grief as like an overall thing, and a theme to recognize how you can actually do it in a way that's healthy, and how sometimes we don't recognize how our grief sort of is broader than what we think it is. Like for me, I see people like throw trash on the ground or have like pieces of broken vehicle laying around everywhere and all of this other stuff, but that was sort of like an extra added to my own grief around, pollution and this idea of like kind of burdening the earth with what we created as trash and kind of don't take responsibility for it. But there was also that part of me that was like, I don't want to see my own connection with it. I don't want to have my own grief around it. I just kind of ignored that it actually exists, and just sort of have a space between myself and the world where it's like that's filled with trash, obviously, because there's people who just kind of have trash laying around out here. And it's like, again, what you see, what you perceive doesn't necessarily just mean it's a one-off, because I've seen it all my life as like cigarette butts and different pieces of trash, and all of that stuff added up to the grief of feeling a distance between like a world that can be clean versus a world where people just don't care. And it's like that's the core of that grief. So I really wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, please share, because it is definitely, when we look at our environment, at what we actually see, and even what we know of our environment that we're not directly seeing, but we know that I was going to say doom is upon us. There's an element of I don't know why I'm laughing. That it's this you're like literally what you're saying. There's this burden energy of our environment, and there is a grief around what the fuck have we done and what the fuck are we doing, and our response to not knowing how to stop it, to clean it, or even what's my participation in it. But to actually take action is also about like, where is it sitting in you, in not just in denial. where else can it move to within ourselves? And grief is one of them.
Absolutely. It was fascinating because it got brought up during one of our magic circle sessions, one of Tom's, where it was talking about it, or where I was talking to Tom about it. And it just became one of those topics that I was really interested in because it was like around communication and like having that ability to communicate it and recognize that sometimes like the burden of what we expect from the entire world is also what we expect for ourselves. Because in a way, we kind of want the world to be cleaner. We kind of want to have no responsibility to the things that are happening around us all the time. You know, arguments, things getting broken, you know, responsibilities with household chores and stuff like that. There is that part of us that just doesn't want to be reciprocal to that relationship, but it's not indicative of us not having that connection for obvious reasons. It shows up for us, which automatically shows that like there is a connection that you have with it, and there's something that is binding you to that responsibility. And it's not necessarily like a punishment, because like for the longest time when I considered grief, it felt like a punishment because it was like all of these people making irresponsible choices, both with their garbage, but also with their lives in different ordeals. It seems like, you know, those people are doing something that I have no control over or I have no responsibility to, but obviously I do. If a neighbor throws trash onto the ground and just lets it float all over the place, obviously that's my own relationship with like, oh yeah, people just don't care. They won't take care of anything if I make something, like, because it will reflect that behavior that you have towards yourself, like the kind of reasoning that you have for not stepping forward or making a move or taking responsibility in your own life. You'll see why you don't. So for me, it's like if I make something, if I create something, they may not care about it. So it's like that relationship is like towards the world as well as like they just don't care. And that's how they like present themselves, or that's what they do is just throw trash all over the place. But it's like that inner relationship too, because I can recognize that and it's there. It's an allowed relationship. And there was also this idea around like different places have like really clean streets. And it's like, but what do they teach people that's different from everywhere else? And it's like, honestly, it's not what you teach people. It's just that responsibility is about that person, how they treat life, but also how you treat your own life, because it's going to reflect one way or another. And really stepping into grief made me realize that I actually have a really deep appreciation for the stuff that they do just kind of toss out into the world, because it's like this part of them is remaining with the world. And even if it gets thrown in the ground, which landfills here in the US are, it's just holes in the ground, uh, it's still going to be a part of the world. It's still a burden. It's still grief that we give to the planet. It's our own way of kind of immortalizing ourselves in the fact that we don't know how to deal with a problem. Solving problems is burying them, which is kind of it's kind of poetic, but also like kind of upsetting if you really think about it. It's just like what we do for ourselves and what we do for each other is like we bury whatever that burden is so that somebody else will deal with it later. And that was also, yeah, now it's like obvious to me, is always that idea is like, oh, the next generation will deal with this problem much better than we did. And this idea is like grief is generational, because we're constantly like, oh yeah, they'll do better than we did in this generation. It's like probably not. Like the idea of like settling in and being okay with the idea that you can just kind of shift the weight onto somebody else is kind of like something I've grown up with, is like, yeah, you know, I was a stupid whatever in my whatever age, but you guys have a better chance than I do. And it's like, you literally have the same chance I do of success. But it's just about where you're focused. And it's like, if you're focused on just shifting the burden until somebody else can step in and become like more powerful or capable than you, but do the thing that you actually want to do and like pursue, never made any sense. But it was something that was interlocked in my growing up, was like this idea that somehow rationally somehow everybody else is going to be responsible for what you've done. And that seems to have translated into my grief, like the way that I experience grief and how I see it in my life is just people throwing trash on the ground and everything else, or leaving their dogs. I like the word, so I'll use it. Feces everywhere for other people to either step in or clean up after them. And it's like that's the idea. Is like that's the working relationship that is developed around me. It's like somebody else will take care of my mess. It doesn't have to be my responsibility to deal with my mess. And it's both like a really relieving thing to recognize that like that's going on outside of you, which means it's a story that is being played out for your entertainment because it's going to be your entertainment. And this idea that you can continue to shift it into other people's responsibilities, it's not, it's always yours. And it was one of those points in my life where I really didn't know how to communicate or like really get out there further with my communication and engaging. So it became more about recognizing where I'm coming from and what those different, yeah, what I've been grieving myself with, because I like the idea of burden. And that burden, like where am I burdening others in my life because I'm not taking that responsibility in moving forward, both in communicating with other people, but also with like communicating with myself. Because there's always that set part of yourself where you're kind of like, no, I'm not going to talk about that side of myself because I don't like that side of myself.
So you're talking about like, as far as a burden, it's not just, we're not just talking about things here.
Absolutely.
It's the level of communication and being in communion with others.
Absolutely. Because it's like communication. I definitely like second William when it comes to like communication is like a higher vibration for like that understanding of like human beings. When we communicate, it's a much higher vibration than when we're just like kind of like flailing our arms in the air or like smacking sticks together. Yes, it sounds really nice, but it's not the voice. The voice carries a lot of impact and a lot of that power that we have that's unique to us because we all have a unique voice. It could be a higher pitch, it could be a lower pitch, it could be distorted in some way, shape, or form, like through stutters and the like. But yeah, absolutely. Like when I look at both emotion and thoughts and also like the way people communicate, and this definitely goes into grief and stuff, is like that universal idea of like having to put up with other people. So it's like when you communicate, you're also trying to reason why things are happening. So you have that communication going on inside of you too with grief, because it's like, oh, this is because of somebody else, because you're always being burdened by somebody else when it comes to grief. Like if somebody dies, then you're grieving, which means you're burdened. You're burdened by somebody else's passing, even though they're not there anymore. They've moved on. You have taken on a communication inside of yourself that is messing you up. So it's the same for like everybody else too. It's like if I see somebody throw trash on the ground or just let their dog poop and just walk away from it, it's like that's a communication that's taking place. It may not be totally vocal, but it is a very energetic interaction that is taking place there for many different reasons. And yeah, like that relationship and the moving forward in it was like also too is like one of the things that really got to me was a lot of people airing their grief about like, you know, picketing, protesting, and doing all of this other stuff to try to raise the vibration to challenge things that are going wrong in their lives. But ultimately they're not communicating with themselves. They're not communicating from a place that is alleviating the burden or the grief. It's a place where they're empowering it because they're trying to fight it. They're trying to talk against it. Like, don't do that. And it's like, they have no reason to to engage and just be like, okay, yeah, don't do that. Because there's an entire push for the gas companies out here to stop making plastic, and they like have their local base in Texas, and they just kind of ignored it, and the fumes and all of that were in a residential area, and it was messing people up medically. And what they decide to do is first take it to like Congress or whatever to try to fight them, and it's like, but they made they passed bills to make sure that like you kind of need it in your everything, in your everyday life. You need the plastic that they produce in order to carry the product. Like it made it into law that you need it. And it's like, so then you can fight them on that. But then it's like, vocal protests for them to stop, and that doesn't do anything. So I was always very compassionate towards like that idea of like stand up for what you believe in, but it's like it's always where you're coming from, right? I mean, it almost sounds like extremely callous, but there is a point in which we're trying to fight ourselves in order to find that balance and to relieve the burden, because we're fighting the burden, not trying to create something new instead. So like that relationship was always a mystery to me, because I mentioned that a friend of mine by the name of Devin Ward, he ended up going into the military. He himself had his own, I'll say like mental inclinations, because it's always like, oh yeah, they're mentally unstable and all this other stuff, but I won't get into that. But he had his own like mental blocks when it came to functioning as a normal person. And he was accepted into the military. And the military, I don't really know what happens in our military. I swear, it's one of those things where I would get into a situation, I would talk about the military all day long, but I know nothing about it because I'm not in it. But he ended up going through many difficult things, both through like exercise, their strict discipline when it comes to like taking care of your stuff, taking care of your space, and being in service to your other people that you're with in your bunk and stuff like that. So it was really difficult for him. And eventually he ended up going AWOL, and he ended up dying in a mine cart, which was coal, because coal carts are still something that we use a lot when it comes to train access and everything, where they pull up, the cart will be empty, and they'll dump the coal in, and those don't necessarily get checked. So he was inside of one, he ended up getting buried under coal, and he died. The situation around that was that nobody knew what happened to him after a while. So they were already in mid-step into grieving. So they were already feeling it really hard that A, they didn't know what happened to him. B, they kind of just feel sad that they should have said something, because we saw him, I think like a week or two before he went AWOL, where he just left the base that he was at, and the base was apparently terrible for what that's worth. So he ended up leaving, and everybody was beating themselves up, burdening themselves with this idea that they could have saved his life, or at least made sure that he was okay before he went back into the military. But nobody did. Nobody really did. Everybody was like, oh yeah, you're doing great, I'm glad you made it, all of this other stuff to like really build his confidence and stuff like that, to remain in the state that he was in and where he was stationed and everything. So it was more like accepting him where he was at, but not necessarily seeing what was wrong. And I would not be the first nor the last to say that there definitely was something that was off, but it wasn't like something I was going to pursue at that time, because for better or worse, can always be caught up in my own head and rationalize things away. So I don't talk about it with the person. So the news came around eventually that they found him, and I think he was missing for like a month or something.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he was gone for a while. And the people who actually looked into it and kept like trying to get answers out of the military, they wouldn't really say anything other than they still didn't find him. He's just gone, and he had his mom, he had his stepdad, I believe, or his actual dad, one of those, and they were worried about him too. So they were constantly getting into contact with the military and trying to find out something. And when the news finally came down, my friends knew about it before I did. Like they ended up like, meeting up and talking about it and then coming to my place together to talk to me about it. And they were so ready, or at least two of them were ready to kind of be there to like consolidate my burden, like to be there so that I can cry or have the reaction. But when I came out, I had a totally different reaction to what they were expecting, except for one of my friends who was always seen as the intellectual. Like he was always up in his head and didn't really like wear his heart on his sleeve or anything like that. He sort of suspected that I was going to be like very warming and like open and smiling and not like crying or anything. And the friend that was like saw me smile and kind of just like, turned to my friend and was like, "You're right, like he didn't cry." Like, and he was like, the friend just kind of shrugged it off. And he was all like, he's dead, like to reassess whether or not like I got it. And I was like, "Yeah, I heard you. He's dead." He's like, "But it was more of a relief that we found him, dead or alive, that he was actually found, rather than just somebody who's gone missing, because that's even worse than being found alive or dead." And he started crying, like the one who really had to question my stance on what was going on. He started crying, and I hugged him and I held him and I was there for him while he was crying. And I really accepted that that burden was finally off of my friend. And, shortly after he went into the military. But that was a moment in which I recognized grief, but I recognized it in a much different way than what I've ever felt before. Because I've lost a dog, I've lost family members I didn't know. And like animals are one of the ones that are like really the hardest when it comes to grief, is like, because you always feel like you didn't do enough for your pet because they're sort of like there with you all the time. And then when it comes to like family members that you don't know, it's really hard to grieve because it's like you can feel other people's pain in regards to a relative that you don't know. Because I never met my grandparents on my mom's side. So I never met her mom and dad because they live in Germany. I've never met my mom and dad on my dad's side either. So there's a lot of relatives that I just don't know. And my grandfather passed away like a couple of years ago. And I couldn't grieve, but my mom was hurting. So I was there for her. And there's this idea, this touches on the taboo part, where it's like everybody expects you to grieve. Like everybody expects that you have some sort of like overwhelming sense of like what that means for you, that you can no longer talk to that person, even if you don't know that person. And I have like a really good track record of not knowing my relatives really well. So when they pass, it's not something that hits me. And even if it is something that hits me, it's usually something that I have, I guess, more responsibility over. So like grief for me is like heavy burden around like not doing enough when it comes to something, like either standing up for something I believe in or taking care of my dog to the best ability, or like being there for them when they're in the most pain. Like for me, that is what hurts the most, is not being there for those that you can actually be there for. But at the same time, that's the taboo part, is like it's about responsibility, and the more responsibility you take on, the more burden it becomes. The more you grieve, the more it hurts. And that's how I've related with grief for such a long time, was that it is that fundamental Latin version of it, not the idea of like, oh, somebody has to pass and then you grieve and you go through like these 5 stages or 6 stages. It's like anger, sadness,
Yeah.
acceptance, all of those. And that never that never happened for me in that way. um I mean, potentially around animals, but usually it was like angry, and then it was just like acceptance. I was really sad about it, and then acceptance. So there's like 3 stages for me when I grieve. Ah, fuck the world. What have you done? Um, but yeah, that's my that's how I've experienced grief when it comes to like the real taboo part of it is like you gotta grieve when somebody passes, but at the same time, it's like, can you really grieve people you never were close enough to feel that? Because there was also this part. I'm gonna go heavy into the taboo here, where it's like it's expected of you. Um, like my brother brought it up to me once, where it was like, hey, like, have you ever um had like a responsibility or something like that, and other people telling you like you have to own that responsibility, and it's like we're sort of like we sort of had like this very weird air around like, oh, you have to be a certain kind of way when something happens. And grief was one of those where it's like when somebody else is hurting, you also have to hurt with them. I mean, yes, like you can be compassionate with another person, and I don't mean empathetic because pretty sure Kathleen could attest to this. Is like the idea of drowning in somebody else's emotions and then carrying it with you is no. You got to keep your own head and your own senses about you, which is why it's compassion. You can share that with them because you can get that sense of like they're hurting, and you can take on that hurt for a short period of time, but you're working with the person when you're compassionate. When you're empathetic, you're suffering the person with you're suffering the agony of what they're going through with them in a way that's not healthy because you're not serving them. You're just there for the pain. Oh, I love the pain.
Give me your pain.
Your pain. I love your pain. Stick it in my veins. Oh. But yeah, that idea and like that concept. Mm, I love it. I love that. And it was like, yeah, like other people, they kind of like get this air about them where it's like kind of like condescending, where it's like, oh, you didn't grieve, oh, you're something or other passed away and you didn't care, like what are you, heartless? No, for obvious reasons, no, because like, you know, I've got veins in my body. I wouldn't be alive if my heart wasn't beating, so can't be heartless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's that thing of how there's a certain, well, you know, what I'm also hearing from you, Marcus, is that there's a certain way in which there's a certain expectation in how we care for ourselves and how we care for each other and how we care for the planet, and how it looks like many different things, and how sometimes it doesn't look like much at all.
Yeah.
The ways in which we care, and it is something to contemplate, because how do we care? Like, how do we care for our heart? How do we care for ourselves? Because there are so many opportunities in which we get distracted, and our need for love, or our need for acceptance, or our need for belonging can take us away from a level of care for ourselves and the bigger all, quite easily.
Absolutely. Because like the moment we like really set ourselves on that like don't care path, it's like a really hard one to break because I'm notorious for like saying I don't care, like, and that's always like that kind of self-referential what is it, you already have your own built-in uh what is it, affirmation, that's the word, you have your own built-in affirmations for how you're feeling on the inside. So like when you say things like I don't care, and it's sort of like a secondary, it's something that you just say, it shows the relationship you have going on inside of you. And it's like that's not, it's not because you focus on not caring, it's just that you've come into contact with your emotions, you've come into contact with caring so much about things and just seeing whatever it is play out. Like if you really cared about something and somebody kind of just like told you like offhandedly like you're not good enough in a way, and you took that on and just like, you know, oh, I don't care about this, this wasn't something that I really put my heart into or anything. Just wipe away those tears. It didn't happen. Like the more you come into those relationships and you just recognize that you've given up on it and just walked away, yeah, it builds up that self affirmation of like, I don't care. Like, because then you're
The
just like,
way
that's my defense.
yeah, it's like a coping. It's like all the ways in which we cope with trauma, and we say things to ourselves so to kind of buffer the hurt, to buffer the feeling.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you've already made a decision on it by the time you use your affirmation.
Mm,
You can't trust people, it's not fair, I don't care. It's just the ways in which we deal with it already internally that we just don't recognize that we're doing. So one of
mm,
mine was like, I don't care. It was one of the ones I used a lot. And it was like coming to realize where I was coming from when it came to saying that out loud was just like, oof. Ow. No, I actually do care. I care a lot. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it. Like,
yeah, you say you
obviously,
don't care because actually you care a lot, and to care means to feel and to hurt, and all those things.
yeah. and and yeah, that too was like a part of like grieving and all of that, because it's like the more you care about something, the more painful it is when it's gone. So it's
Mm,
like when we recognize when something is gone and we recognize that something is never going to be in our immediate vicinity again, then what do we do with all that care that we showed for that person? What do we do
mm,
with it when we've hit that point in which we're grieving, where we burdened ourselves with all the things we didn't do in order to care for that person? And that was one of the things that really came across to me, because there was like, when I didn't take it very personally that my friend passed away, or he was my friend, but then when he came back he was more of an acquaintance. So it was like the relationship too changed, like the way that I saw him changed, and that too like created a different way in which I cared about him. I cared that he would like come back in one way or another, but there were those who were still like, this person means this to me, so like my level of care is much higher. And it's like, no, like when it comes to relationships, the level of care isn't about how badly you hurt. It's about whether or not you're willing to be there to even care about what happened to that person. So like for me to be there for my friend, and my friend's name was Turok, and he started crying, I cared about what it meant for him. I was compassionate for what it meant for him, that he would never see Devin again, that we would never see Devin again. And that's my level of care, that I'm willing to take care of other people and see them for, the hurt that they're experiencing and everything, and accept that grief, accept the
mm,
fact that they're there and they're hurting in that moment and they need somebody to support that with them, so they're not alone. So when it came to like all of the relationships in which we dynamically, because we do have like this pseudo energy when it comes to like, how much do you care? Because if you care about the planet, it's like there are those who are willing to like rally and like get people together, but it's like ultimately, where's that energy coming from? It must be in direct contrast to those you don't see caring about the planet, like gas company and all the people they've hurt making plastic. Like, you rally, you get all these people together and you have these picket signs and everything else, but it ultimately doesn't inject the same care. It's just burden. Like you're just there to celebrate the fact that you're powerless to deal with this corporation that seems to be more powerful than you. And it's like, but what are you doing? Like you're just creating more of a wall and an obstacle, rather than caring enough to see more, to recognize where that effort can be put somewhere else. And that was also something too, was like when it came to grief and recognizing grief as like a concept, but also as a relationship. It's like, how do you go into a relationship with another person or even with a full group of people and still care about what's going on, but ultimately bring it to a point where it's like, okay, like you don't have to continue charge uphill. Like, you're heard, people recognize you, they recognize the effort you put in by being at these rallies and raising your voice. But as long as you're communicating the burden that this company is creating, ultimately you're not caring whether or not there is a bigger picture to like how you actually create something when they destroy something. And yeah, when it comes to grief, it was one of those that I really had to like be with, like walk around outside and see the trash on the side of the road, pick it up, feel what that's like to like put yourself there to where you're dealing with the problem rather than just like having a vision. And it's so different to have a vision of the world that you would love versus fighting and trying to burden yourself with taking care of what everybody else does, because it's like no matter what, you're one person. And even if you have a group of people who feel alone, that's the energy that goes into fighting. And so much of that grief and that level of care, it the disharmony affects everybody. And yeah, you might begin to care about the people around you while you're rallying to this one cause, but it ultimately isn't coming from a place where you're just like, I want to create something new. Hey guys, we've been yelling at this building for like 12 days. Maybe we should just go create like a group where we can just like hang out, chill, build communities together, and just have a great time, see what happens. And yeah, like understanding grief and like coming to this relationship with it has like really broadened like that horizon for me of like what it actually means. And I'm glad that you pointed out that the care part of it, it's like, yeah, caring, like grief is directly connected to caring, because they're not two separate entities, they're one and the same. Just like everything that goes on in your life is, it's one and the same. If the caring is something that you're like, oh, of course people don't care, then like people will continue to not care, because that's how you see them, that's how the relationship continues to build. But if it's like, this person is obviously doing whatever, let them do whatever. You can still care about them, you can still care about what happens. It's just when it reaches the point of where you're burdening yourself so much because you care so much, it's that same side. It's just the other side of the coin where you're just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna bury myself in burden. So oh, yeah, I really love this topic, and I wasn't expecting it to go this way, but I love the way that it went. It's a very interesting topic, and I'm certain that there are a number of ways that people have experienced both being, I don't know why the word came up to me, but I'll use it because it's great, is like what is it, like grief harassed? Like you're not grieving hard enough.
Interesting, because I spoke to a friend yesterday and I told her, that we're getting together and we're having conversations around taboo, desire, and fear, and the current theme of grief. And it was really lovely to get her expression. I'm really curious because everyone will have a different response in regards to, because culturally, she was saying, culturally, she comes from an Italian background, and how at a funeral, everyone would be wailing. Everyone's wearing black and they're wailing, and there's a full permission of full expression of grief and of crying and of being like spent, like fully like and expressive. Like she said, her nonna threw herself on the coffin, and was wailing. And she was saying that after that funeral, like after the funeral, no one expresses grief. Like no one has that full expression anymore. It's like everyone goes back to kind of like you it's like you do not show a sign of weakness of grief after that moment. And then she was saying she went to an Australian funeral where the funeral was more about sharing stories and having a laugh and really celebrating that person's life and all the stories that people shared around that person's life. And how it was, there's a party afterwards, and everyone drinks, and it's all about storytelling, and there's everyone's wearing colors, so there's no one's wearing black, and she was saying that that type of engagement of people like being allowed to smile would be very taboo at, say, another cultural wedding, and when the culture is different. So yes, just mentioning that to someone, I got this whole story about different ways, like where culturally that what's seen as appropriate and not appropriate. So it's that kind of harassing to be grieved. It's like, yeah, and it all happens differently.
Yeah. And like, absolutely, like when it comes to creativity, like there's an endless way to like, grieve. Like you could grieve by like painting somebody a portrait and then just like lighting it on fire and like dancing naked around it. Like literally whatever it would be. But yeah, there are like those cultural norms of like, there's this idea that you have to grieve a certain kind of way, you have to hurt a certain kind of way. And it's kind of weird because it's like you're all of a sudden everybody's the hurt police. It's like, is he hurting enough, or is she hurting enough, or is she like telling the story like with gusto? Like, what the hell is up with this person if they're not this kind of way? And yeah, it's a lot like it. It's like the interesting thing is like it's grievance around grieving, which I think is funny. So it's like double burden. Like you've got the burden of burdening not hard enough or not long enough. Like that's kind of like the idea too, is like
it's almost like a grief, and then you look around to see, can I either keep going, or is it okay, or will I pull back? There is a certain maybe management of that, but it's interesting because I've never, as far as, when we talk about death cycles, like death and creation, and, when I think about when like there's a full expression of emotion and crying, it's like in public, I for me personally, I like that kind of Italian way of like flinging yourself onto a thing and like wailing and crying. Like, that's not something I've done before. Like I do it in the privacy of my own kind of domain. If I wanted to cry heavy, it's not, crying in public is not something that that I don't normally allow myself to do. And that normally, if I do feel the tears coming, because obviously, when my mum passed away, or just, like where I'm feeling tender and sore about a heartbreak or something like that, tears can well at any time these days, pretty much on a daily basis. So, and I can be on a bus, or I can be anything, on anywhere at work, and usually it's just a moment of tear, welling up. And then, but then there's this like this kind of self-care and self-management, and how to like, like the waters rise, and it's like I'm trying to manage to try and like quickly get them back as much as and as quickly as I possibly can in breathing, and and it's not so much a panic attack, but yeah, there's like definitely in society, it's like not a easy space to like navigate that sometimes. And sometimes different people do allow the overflow in that moment, wherever you are, on the bus or the train, or what happened, however it happens. So it's yeah, there's a cultural acceptability, or how do you care for yourself and for your heart in a cycle of grief, in a cycle of death, in a cycle of rebirth, where even when something new blossoms, like sometimes there is still the grief of what hasn't, of what had to be aborted, or what has been miscarried, or there's a grief of what also hasn't happened or come to fruition. Even when life is amazing, I know for me, it's like sometimes I feel tears. It's like relief tears, those tears, like you're just like,
you can smile after them. That's how you know they're
yeah,
really
it's just it's almost like a let go of release of the trying of what I thought my life would be, or what I thought this was going to be, or this love that kind of happened easily, but I know I was kind of in this other space trying to make myself be okay, not okay, but now I'm okay, so there's a certain sense of relief tears that can happen in the cycle of grief and letting go and death and life. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love it because there's also this tribe in Africa. I don't know the exact tribe, but there's this lady who's, used to being here in America and all of that, and a descendant of the slave trade that happened here in America. And she ended up having a lot of grief around that relationship with America and not knowing her family and all of this other stuff and trying to find that reconnection. So she ended up meeting with this tribe and like really connecting with them and having conversations, and she would just cry, like, because there'd be certain profound things that a member of the tribe would talk about, and she would just start crying. And apparently her sister who went with her was really bad and she would cry because she cried basically all the time. And because of that, like the tribe would get together, and anybody who heard them like singing and taking this moment to like really bring it out of the person, like they would come in to like the hut that they were in and express themselves musically in order to bring out the tears. So the person would cry, and like they were open to cry and grieve as much as they wanted. And I was like, that's really cool, because like there's somebody who was like super loud when they were like singing outside that like basically drowned out everyone else in the hut, and they came in, they were even louder. And it was like, that's really cool, because like that idea of like bringing people together by the fact that you mourn, because like that too happens, like the grieving and the mourning and all of that stuff that's happening to you. It's like, not only is it like one of those things that kind of like it's taboo, because like we kind of don't know how to deal with grief sometimes when we're a developed country, because we're kind of like, what's appropriate? You like put your hand on the person's back, on all that can be awkward. You give them a hug, maybe they don't want a hug, like it gets awkward. But
Yeah.
it's beautiful to see, like, if you do, like, there are so many people who do cry, but they also have a community, like publicly, like YouTube. Like there's at least two people I know of who have cried and have been embraced, both in a meme kind of way and another one who is embraced by like a defensive kind of way. And of course, the first one being the meme is a guy, and the other being female. And it's like the protective part of you does want to protect, like, the feminine side from like hurting. But like for the masculine side, it's kind of like funny, American humor of like men crying and all that other BS. So there's also that. But yeah, I definitely get that. Crying in public, like I tried really hard not to cry in public, but there were so many times in which I did. But it was always a silence. Like it wasn't that other people either noticed or like paid attention, but even if they did, it was like they would give me my space so I could cry. And it wasn't like people trying to protect me either. It was like, because there is that beautiful part of you that's like, you can be open to crying, but there can also be like, you must stop other people from noticing that you're crying. Because I've seen that before too. It's like, where they're like, oh, give them space, like don't get too close, they're crying right now, and all of this other stuff. And it's like, yeah, it's grief is such an interesting thing, and like care is also a very interesting dynamic that's a part of grief. And I love it. I love this topic because of that, because it's so open to interpretation too, because it's like, what constitutes grief? It's like anytime you burden yourself, really. Anytime you look at like the fact that you want to cry, or the fact that you want to punch somebody in the face, you're going to burden yourself because you're going to hold it back.
Yeah, it's like the moment you care, there's grief right there,
There. Oh, it's great.
It's interesting, just raising a point in regards to when we visually see other people grieving, or crying in general, whether tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of grief, what you pointed on into how we care for others. So the reaching out, the touching, the hugging, the wanting, it's like there's this thing of wanting to give people space, but sometimes in that moment when I know, because I'm someone who I kind of keep people at an arm's distance, even though I'm a friendly person, but as far as I'm not super tactile, except when people are really close, right? So for people to come in, so if I'm crying and if someone to come into my space and hold me, that's quite a big thing for me. And but it's exactly what you want in some ways. It's always like hard to receive, but it's like, I just need a shoulder to cry on right now. And thank you for coming in. So it's like, and you really said, I know for me, when it happens, when someone steps into my space, because I spend a lot of time holding up a barrier, if someone is brave enough to come into that space and hold me, regardless of my barrier, because I'm hurting, it's like, I can feel their sense of power. I can feel their sense of like courage and bravery. It's like, I'm going to cross a border here and I'm just going to give them some love. It's like, fucking good on you. So I'm almost crying the fact that I isolate myself in that action when that someone comes in close. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. It's that vulnerability. Oh no, stop! I'm vulnerable right now.
No, give me space. And then if it's like the child having a tantrum and all they want is their mum and dad to hold them, kind of. It's in some ways it's that kind of same energy. It's like I'm all over the place. So that holding, it's like, oh, I got you. Like you are a solid form. You're not scattered.
Even though you
microbes. Yeah, a million pieces. Yeah.
Oh, that actually brings up like a really good point. Is that like it's your defenses, right? Like the moment you actually start crying, like all your defenses fall away. And that's where that vulnerability is just like now you've just like embraced it and you're going through the you're going through the roller coaster. So yeah, like you don't want other people to realize that you're on that roller coaster and that you really want something. But again, it's like denial of the heart happens all the time. So it's like, of course, the heart wants you to connect with other people. Of course, like.
Can I get you to talk about like when men cry? Because it is a stigma, isn't it? Like, and it's like, when you're crying, what is it that you want? Well, of course, exactly what you just said. The heart wants connection. It wants someone to hold them.
Yeah, it's
but I'd love
super
you to
funny.
speak about that a bit more. That would be lovely.
Oh, definitely. I would love. I'm gonna relish this. Going into that topic, being a man and crying, there is that heavy stigma of like you have to have it together. Like for whatever reason, like men have to have like toughness, like emotional toughness. Like if you punch them in the face a few dozen times, they've got to like show no blood or weakness whatsoever. And it's like this idea that like it was a translation of masculine, right? Like where masculine and man became like this, oh, you have to be the protector, you have to be the defender, you have to be able to take the brunt of the world and then be able to shoulder it. So you're already considered grieved as a man. You're grieved permanently as a man. That's kind of like the idea, the modern idea of it is like you can't show your weaknesses, you can't cry, you can't fight back if somebody's abusing you, especially if it's a woman. Like you can't do any of that. And for me to cry, it's like I have to like really be hurting in order to cry. But I've had my own relief cries as well, where it's like I kind of just accept things aren't the way that I've thought that they were. And like, man, I've cried so many times. And there's always like this kind of idea, especially like from my dad. I'll say it from my dad, he's like, oh, you're so soft. And it was like the energy it carries when he says that I'm soft is like it triggers that part of me that's like, no, I'm not. Like I'm a man, or at least man? It becomes a question for me, even, where it's like, what the fuck does it mean if you can't own your own emotions and stuff like that and feelings if you actually have them? Like, what is that supposed to mean? Because like automatically for a man, it's like you're weak. Like there's something about it that means like you're broken or like you're not whole if you're crying. And it's like, then what the fuck do I have emotions for? Why do I want to cry then? Like if I'm not allowed to have them. And yeah, like that stereotype of like, oh yeah, if you show emotions, you're a this or you're a that. You're not even considered a man anymore, like when you cry. And it's like that consideration and all of that energy is like, again, it's like grief. Like you're constantly burdening yourself to prove that you're a man by not crying. And it was
Mm.
like, even the recognition of like what it means to cry, it must be like a very special occasion and you got to keep it to yourself, was like that idea of like expressing your emotion. And it's like the more you do it.
So I'm loving what's happening. So you're just reiterating like to express your emotion, you're not allowed to do it with others. It has to be by yourself.
Yeah, you're basically alone. And if
Alone.
other people
Yeah.
see you, then you're a something or other. You're soft. You're
It's like demasculating. It's like
yeah, you're no longer a man if you cry. You're no longer
wow.
strong.
That's quite a heavy burden, isn't it?
Yeah, like every bit of like what it means to be a
To
man.
not allowed to have emotion or certain emotion. Because there's some emotion that you're allowed to have, isn't there?
Yeah, you're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be upset. You're allowed to like be pissed off, but like genuine, soft, weak can't happen. Like automatically as a man, it can't happen. You can't do that. Like the moment you do it, it means again like you're soft. You're the P word, which I'll go ahead and use. It's just like you're a pussy, you're a woman, you're this, you're that. And it's like, what does that mean? But yeah, like you automatically are no longer considered a man if you show emotion. Like the moment you show it, it's like you're dead. Your manhood, everything has just been stripped from you, and you have to go.
It's like you die. Like your ego is saying, if you cry, you die.
You're dead.
Yeah.
You're a dead man. At least half of you is dead, and it could never come back unless you do something super heroic, like help people or fight a bear on top of a mountain with a chainsaw for arms. Something super masculine.
But you're allowed to cry after you do something seriously heroic.
Yeah. Being a man is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. Is that what you said?
Being a man is ridiculous. By far, it is like, not only is it like an understatement to say like the pressure that you get for like having to fit in amongst other men being super high, like the bar for it is really high, because not only are you holding yourself to that standard, the other men are also holding themselves to that standard. So to fit in, you got to be just as manly, just as into football, just as into like drinking and fornicating your brain out and getting as many women as possible. Like that's the ideal. And it actually reminds me of a time where I was working for Boy Scouts, and the boys that I ended up like accumulating, these are young men, but I call them boys because that's the way they acted. Juvenile. Anyway, they wanted to hit.
Yeah, it's still a man psychology, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They wanted to hit on the already emotionally I would say unstable, but it's not necessarily that. They were emotionally unavailable because of everything that was happening for them. Because I arrived with them, with the females that were in the cab with me. And we worked in the kitchen, and it was Boy Scouts. And they had this whole men nowhere near women thing. that was going on, but I won't get into that because it was stupid and it was ridiculous and it was bad for our health as far as men are concerned. Um, and eventually these three guys ended up joining me because I was the only guy aside from the head chef. And when they arrived, they were really cool. Everyone was laid back and all of that. But eventually they started doing that stupid group mentality man thing where they start talking about women like they're pieces of meat rather than intellectual beings you can talk to. And it was one of those things that just rubbed me the wrong way because of where I was at and just where my attentiveness was at because of the energy that that fuels is like you want to disrespect them and they're here to work and so are you. You don't just come here to disrespect them. And first they wanted nothing to do with them, and then all of a sudden it was all about them. Like everything that they talked about was like, oh, how do we get them over to our cabin, how do we like sleep with them and all of this other stuff. And it was like, it was really annoying because by that time I was like extroverted out of my box and just really there for like the experience of it. And I'm using like a lot, but I'll leave it. And they wanted that. They wanted that experience to be with them and be sexually involved with them and everything else, when at first they were abstinent towards the idea, but then grew towards that idea for some reason. And I ended up wanting to just lead them to their space, just not deal with them because it's toxic, of that idea and the way that they talk about them and everything. And eventually I left that environment, and that was the idea, was like I didn't want to be like them, so they automatically labeled me old man and already were ready to like disrespect me and just like avoid me at all costs.
So you were ostracized from the group.
Yeah, I was ostracized from being a man.
From the man group. Yeah.
I was no longer a man. I was an old man.
Mm.
It was so funny. It was so dumb at the same time. Mainly
it's definitely that peer group and group mentality that happened. I mean, women, it happens a different way, but yeah, I just really am curious to see how grief plays out amongst men and how taking care and emotions, kind of all the ways in which we cope and don't cope around that.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. And I do want to know the other side of this, because obviously for the men's side, it's very toxic. It's not great. And it was interesting because at least one of the boys in that group, I ended up calling them my sons because that's the way they acted, was kind of like disrespectful towards their elder and just like really gung-ho to prove themselves, even though there was nothing to prove. So it was ridiculous. And yeah, the suffering and the grief that they already had, like that got buried by them trying to pursue the feminine, which I find to be fascinating, because that's the other side of it.
Tell me more about that, because it's like the feminine is the embodiment of like we feel emotion and we express emotion. So it's like, are they, for men, is it like when they are wanting, like their desire for for the feminine, like in this situation, their desire for the meatiness, the desire to have women and to have sex with them, it's like, is it like they want something, they want an internalization of like an energy, a desire, like maybe it's their own proving to themselves, their own wanting, it's like or wanting a sense of their own wholeness in receiving women's emotionality or something. It's like, I know, I'm just kind of playing with, there's no right or wrong, but
right,
it's still, there's like a denial of self and something, so we're wanting it. Like I would love to another session talk about desire because
Absolutely.
I'm really big on not making a man's desire for a woman bad, because women spend a lot of time wanting to be desired,
Absolutely.
and
And
that's the whole, it's like it's a whole thing.
and same thing for men, like going out, getting buff, getting the nice car, getting a decent job. Like that's the idea, is like now you're presentable to the opposite sex and or the same sex, maybe, if that's where you're going with that. But ultimately, yeah, you're seeking that acceptance of some kind from the opposite. So yeah, absolutely. I can see it as like you want the feminine so bad, but you don't recognize that you have it in yourself. So you're looking for the messages, you're looking for the emotion, you're looking for that connection to everything, but ultimately you deny it when it's in relationship to something that you don't even pay attention to, which definitely does happen amongst men, is like that denial of emotion that something's going on. Even if it's like them being angry and being upset, it's for some reason there's that moment where they draw back and they don't want to accept the fact that they're pissed off in that moment, and they're going to still run that anger, but they're not willing to talk about it with another guy. They would talk to it to their wife or to a female friend, but they would never talk about it to a guy. Or they might talk to to a guy about it and just completely hide themselves from women.
I do know men that say that they feel more comfortable talking to other men about their emotions than they are to women.
Yeah, it's interesting, and because I've seen it, I've seen mainly like the men version of like connecting and having that bond and being able to talk about it, but I've also seen the opposite of where they deny it when they're talking to an actual guy that they have a problem with, just to talk to their girlfriend or their female companion, whoever it might be, about that relationship. And it's interesting, and yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation.
So is there anything that else you want to add to the taboo of grief, to that this kind of story in relationship to wholeness?
Yeah, just grief isn't something that is absent of caring, and it should always be considered whenever anybody grieves. And that goes for like anybody who watches this, that you can grieve and be accepted exactly where you're at when you grieve, because as hard as it is to take, like that vulnerability is the key to a future that you otherwise wouldn't have moving forward. And that care can turn into self-care, especially if it was somebody or something that was very dear to you that you lost.
So true, that the care that you had for another turns to self-care, and just the action of grieving is a step in that way, isn't it? In the step of self-care.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Thanks, Marcus.
And thank you, Kathleen.